The Group of Seven, or G7, is a club of the world's most powerful democracies: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US. Each year, these leaders gather to tackle the planet's biggest problems: economy, security, and the environment. In June 2025, the summit took place in Kananaskis, Alberta, with the dramatic Rocky Mountains as a backdrop. But this was no ordinary meeting. The world faced multiple crises, and unity among the G7 was in short supply. Tensions ran high, with deep divisions over trade and global conflicts. Some even called it a G6+1 summit, hinting at the US's increasingly divergent path. For Canada, hosting meant trying to bridge these divides and salvage some sense of unity. The stakes were enormous. A successful summit would show the world that democracies could still work together. Failure would signal that the West's most powerful alliance was fracturing. The world watched, waiting to see if the G7 could overcome its differences. The Kananaskis summit was a critical test of Western unity. The outcome would shape global politics for years to come. At the center was Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, a former central banker now thrust into global politics. This was Carney's first major international test, and he faced a familiar challenge: US President Donald Trump, back in office and doubling down on America first. Trump's unpredictable style and history of clashing with Canadian leaders loomed over the summit. Carney's mission: avoid a repeat of the 2018 summit's public meltdown and defend Canada's interests. The dynamic between Carney and Trump was the summit's main drama. Other leaders, like France's Macron and Germany's Merz, watched closely, hoping Carney could keep the peace. The G7 needed US cooperation to address urgent global issues, but Trump's approach threatened to derail progress. The contrast was stark. Carney, calm and measured. Trump, brash and disruptive. The chemistry between these two would shape the summit's outcome. For Carney, the challenge was to stand firm without provoking a diplomatic crisis. The world's eyes were on this new Canadian leader. Could he manage the pressure and keep the G7 together? The 2025 G7 summit faced a world in turmoil. The Israel-Iran conflict was escalating, with Israel targeting Iran's nuclear sites and fears of a wider war growing. The ongoing war in Ukraine remained dire, with Russia launching fresh attacks on Kiev just before the summit. Ukrainian President Zelensky was set to plead for more support, but G7 unity on Ukraine was faltering. Meanwhile, the global economy was under strain. Rising inflation, supply chain woes, and trade disputes. President Trump's tariffs on allies, including Canada, deepened divisions. The G7's agenda revolved around three crises: Middle East tensions, Ukraine, and trade wars. Each issue was complex, with no easy solutions. The leaders needed to find common ground, but disagreements, especially with the US, ran deep. The world expected action, but the path forward was uncertain. The Kananaskis summit was a moment of truth for the G7. Would they rise to the challenge, or reveal their divisions? The stakes had never been higher. President Trump wasted no time making headlines. On day 2, he announced he'd leave the summit early, skipping crucial talks on Ukraine and trade. His early exit shattered any illusion of unity. Before departing, Trump posted a dramatic ultimatum. He called for the evacuation of Tehran and gave Iran 60 days to negotiate on its nuclear program. He made this announcement without consulting his G7 partners, leaving them scrambling. The other leaders rushed to issue a joint statement. Iran must never have a nuclear weapon, and all sides should de-escalate. But Trump refused to clarify if the US would use military force, deepening uncertainty. For host Mark Carney, Trump's actions threatened to derail the entire summit. The America First approach was on full display. Trump acted alone, leaving allies to pick up the pieces. The summit's fragile unity was in tatters. The G7 was left to salvage what little common ground remained. The world saw a group struggling to stay together. The Kananaskis summit teetered on the edge of chaos. Prime Minister Carney responded with quiet, careful diplomacy. His goal: prevent a public breakdown and keep the summit on track. Carney avoided direct confrontation with Trump, focusing instead on building personal rapport. He sought out one-on-one talks, searching for even the smallest areas of agreement. Surprisingly, Trump responded positively, referring to Carney by name and speaking respectfully. This was a sharp contrast to past summits. Carney stood firm on Canadian interests, calmly rejecting Trump's aggressive rhetoric. He also worked to unite the other G6 leaders, creating a counterbalance to the US position. This dual strategy, cordiality with Trump, solidarity with allies, kept the summit from collapsing. French President Macron praised Carney for holding the group together. The summit didn't solve its biggest problems, but Carney's approach prevented disaster. Sometimes survival is victory. Trade was the summit's deepest fault line. Trump insisted on high tariffs to protect US jobs, hitting allies like Canada with steep taxes on steel, aluminum, and cars. Canada and Mexico faced tariffs up to 25%, justified by US security concerns. For Canada, these tariffs were a major threat. Carney pushed for a new trade deal to remove them, arguing that cooperation, not conflict, would benefit both countries. Trump called a deal achievable, but offered no details or concessions. The two leaders agreed to keep negotiating, but progress was minimal. Other G7 leaders, like Macron, pushed for a collective approach to global trade. Trump rejected this, threatening to make separate deals or impose more tariffs. The summit ended with no breakthrough, just a commitment to keep talking. The trade divide remained as deep as ever. The G7 left Kananaskis with economic tensions unresolved. The world's biggest democracies were still at odds. G7 unity on Ukraine crumbled at Kananaskis. Trump's early exit meant he missed Ukrainian President Zelensky's urgent plea for help. Without US agreement, the G7 couldn't issue a joint statement on Ukraine. Instead, Carney released a host nation statement, far weaker than the unified message Ukraine needed. Still, Canada, the UK, and the EU announced new sanctions and military aid for Ukraine. But the lack of American participation was glaring. Trump's refusal to join new sanctions left allies worried about US commitment. German Chancellor Merz warned that Trump's rhetoric echoed Kremlin talking points. The summit confirmed fears of a growing rift between the US and its allies. For Ukraine, the message was mixed and troubling. The West's united front was cracking. The world took notice. The 2025 G7 summit was a study in contradictions. Carney managed to secure joint statements on less controversial issues like securing supply chains for critical minerals. But on trade and Ukraine, the G7 was more divided than ever. The G6+1 reality was clear. The US stood apart from its allies. Carney's diplomatic skill kept the summit from total collapse, earning praise from leaders like Macron. Yet the fundamental differences in worldview were impossible to hide. The summit showed that the G7 could cooperate on secondary issues, but not on the crises that mattered most. The meeting ended with divisions on full display. The alliance of democracies looked fragile. The world saw a group struggling to adapt to new realities. The Kananaskis summit left more questions than answers. For Mark Carney, the summit was a personal diplomatic victory. He managed Trump, protected Canada's interests, and earned respect from fellow leaders. But for the G7, the summit fell short. There was no breakthrough on trade, no unified support for Ukraine, and no clear plan for the Middle East. The divisions, especially between the US and its allies, were too deep to bridge. The G7's influence depends on unity, and this summit exposed its limits. Without American leadership, the group's power is diminished. The Kananaskis meeting showed the West's alliance is at a crossroads. For Canada, it was a moment of calm leadership under fire. For the G7, it was a warning. Unity cannot be taken for granted. The beautiful mountains of Kananaskis witnessed a summit defined by challenge, not triumph. The future of the world's democracies remains uncertain.